Now, as you see with this video title with it, I'm going to be going over with it with how MAGA doesn't really have an ability to survive. I'm first going to go after kind of like internationally. Internationally, it's basically the idea of nationalism. Now, nationalism, as we've seen, it's been in steep decline. There's even, when you start to look at the United Kingdom, they've been basically receding. Uh, even their even their prime minister does not even believe in it, and even his actions show that. When it comes down to other countries, the moment that Trump was not reelected in the United States, we saw that Bolsonaro in Brazil had actually shown that he was very, very worried about the chances of reelection out there. You see out in Turkey with Erdogan, he was showing worries of not being reelected. We've seen out in France. France, it can't even take hold. We've seen out in the Philippines, where people have actually protested against Duterte. So it's shown across the whole world with it. And even when we've seen with Vladimir Putin has actually stated that he is not a nationalist. And when we start to look at this, we can actually see just when we look at that, it's just not prevalent. Now, when we look at now, we need to look at nationally. Is it actually the ability for it to actually survive nationally? Now, for this, we need to actually start looking at the numbers. Now, we need to look at how there are total number, what system we're actually looking at. We're actually looking at the modern system, which actually shows that 20% are loyal to Democrats, 20% are loyal to Republicans, 60% are independent or third party. Even amongst those 20% that are loyal to Democrat and Republican, we know that 85% of those votes are actually split tickets. We're not going to go into that right now with it because that's kind of a different issue. That's usually ends up focusing on more down ballot. But what we're going to go into is what the actual top of the ballot ends up impacting on the overall election on the president. Now we know the total. There's about 330 million people in the country. That's about the average state. That means about 6.6 million people. For non-voters, is about a third of the total people, which including what it called, we're gonna basically use bulk numbers on this just to basically get this is about a third of the population, and it ends up being roughly about 109 million people, or about roughly we're talking in the realm of 2.2 million per state. For voters, for actual voters, we're talking about 221 million people, and we're talking about 4.4 million per state about. Now, when we start to break it down, you're going to find out what these actual numbers actually mean. For the independents, this is about just shy of about 140 million people, or about just about 2.8 million people per state. That would mean that when we start talking about the GOP and the DNC, for each of them, we're talking that they each get about 44 million, just shy of about a little over 44 million. So for each of them, and that means per state with a little less than 900,000 per state on average for the average state. Certain states going to be higher, certain states going to be lower. These are just median averages. Now we need to, now that we've gone over those kind of bulk numbers, now we need to actually showcase what are the actual MAGA voters. Now we're going to go over what Rand Paul was stating on it. He feels that a third of those voters for the GOP are MAGA voters. That means that basically out of that total 100% of people in the country, that means roughly about 4.5% of them are MAGA voters. That means when we're talking about the total number, that means roughly about 15 million people. That means about 200, that means roughly about 300,000 per state. Nowhere near the what it called, we're talking nowhere near the about 3 million independent voters per state, which is, or even nowhere near the 900,000 GOP per state. That's within the realm of that. We're talking they have other people with it. And then within each of the MAGA groups with it, it splits into kind of five people, five different groups of types of voters. You have the kind of the MAGA, the people that are kind of loyal to the GOP. Basically, they're basically just voting against the Democrats. They're not necessarily not necessarily very loyal to the traditional MAGA movement. They'll kind of like spout out a lot of the slogans. They're just more of saying, I just don't want to, I'm with the GOP. It doesn't matter who they nominate. I'm just not going to vote for a Democrat. And I don't believe that a third party is going to get enough support to win, even though I like a lot of the stuff third parties support. You get these people with it. I run into a lot of these people. And the next group with it are nationalists. Now, these are basically people you'll find in both the realms of the Republican Party and Democratic Party. Basically, you'll find as socialists with it, like Bernie Sanders, just as much as Trump supporters. They are not really partisan at all. These are people that are, in many cases, they're nativists with it. They just want basically, and they tend to be racially uniform with whites only. Not necessarily that they're white nationalists with it. It's just they tend to it tends to gravitate toward that one group. I'll get to the other idea with it in a minute. But you'll find that tends to be with that idea. These are people that basically believe the United States is superior to other nations, and they want to basically save it for only people who are within the United States. And this can mean anything from basically only this can mean a lot of times in just shutting off the borders with it. Some people believe that. A lot of the people are like that with it, where they want basically a lot of this pro-union stuff. It's a lot of ends up being socialist type of views. Then you had the celebrity. This is basically celebrity supporters, basically because Trump has been a real estate mogul, and obviously other businesses as well. He's been in movies and TV. He had his own reality TV show with The Apprentice. He's going to have a celebrity factor as well. So there's going to be this factor as well. It's going to contribute. There's going to get a fan base as well that are going to vote for him. Now, these people are not actually concerned about the actual fact of what he's stating or what he's for. They're just voting for him because, hey, I like Trump because I'm a fan of him. Not necessarily of anything that he's actually doing, not necessarily that he's doing anything positive or negative or neutral to these people, just because they're a fan of him because of his celebrity. Then you got the conspiracy theorists, but these aren't necessarily partisan on either side. They just basically follow the wackiest conspiracy theories, and a lot of them are following him right now because he's supporting some of the stuff like QAnon. And once these things, obviously what we're going to find out is once these things wear out, is he's going to lose these people. Then you got the end, which is these racists, these white nationalist types with it, the neo-Nazi types, etc., that are basically don't want people that look like them in the country. And since his immigration policy fits that with it, they support him. And what we have here with it is these are basically the five groups that are going to support him. Now, if you were to what we'll look here with it is to show you his support. The best way to do that is if he were to start a third party. Now, the true loyalists would basically be in one group, and that comes basically from the celebrity and the racist. This is basically the only ones that he could actually count on. The nationalists would basically say, we want a larger platform. They're going to go to the Democrats because the Democrats are allowing a larger platform for the Democratic Socialists, which would allow that. The conspiracy theorists would obviously go elsewhere because that's eventually going to, what we're seeing is it's dying out and it's kind of separating and it's splitting and it's splintering off. And we're seeing with the GOP people, they're not going to leave. They're just going to go with whoever the GOP nominee is. They're not just going to say, oh, I'm going to go with a third party, because they're going to explain that a third party's not going to have anything to be able to block the Democrats. They're only there to block the Democrats. And what we find is that what we're left with is, off the top 100%, is we're left with about 1.8% roughly, or it ends up being like 1.7866 repeating with it. So the 1.786 repeating. So that's the percentage. So about 1.8% if we're going to go out just to the most narrow amount for the total percentage of that, of the actual 100%. And when we start to view that with it, we see that the actual total number of people it would be left with on these true loyalists would be roughly about, we're talking like 6 million people, which means about a little over 100,000 people per state, 117,920. Not a huge number with it. It wouldn't make any legitimate impact. They wouldn't even be able to grab even one congressional seat unless it was specifically targeted. And even if it was specifically targeted, it would be a very, very tight race anyway if they were specifically targeting one area only. And it's not likely that these people would, because they're usually split up. Now, when we look at potential loyalists, these would go with the national. This is so assuming that you're able to get the nationalists, the celebrity, and the racist. The conspiracy would obviously split, because conspiracy is showing that it is splitting up. This would be at best about 2.68% of the total, about just shy of 9 million voters total, about just shy of 180,000 per state. Again, it would not make a huge number. Mind you, that the max that they could even assume, even if you assume basically all of these people follow, which even you're including the idea of these people that are just going as an anti-Democrat voters, which I mean, even at max with it, you're talking let's see what percentage we can get out of it. I mean, you're talking maybe like a 3.6%, and max possible voters would be basically about what's that? Just shy of 12 million. And that's basically, you're talking about less than 240,000 per state. And that's the maximum possible you can get, and it's going to be split up. And that's not a lot of people in a country. And even though it would be a fairly good output with it, it would not put them on the stage of a debate. because when we start to look at that, I mean, even at the max with it is I mean, you're talking the max percentage with it that they would get up to would be about a 5.33 when you start to view just the eligible voters. So you're talking basically, we're talking like a 5%. And when you're talking just a 5% as a third party, that's you need a 15% to get onto the debate stage. So they would never get onto the debate stage. That's why when we start to talk about these things, it shows that they're not even eligible for to get as a third party. And it doesn't matter how popular people think that Trump is, he doesn't have a grasp even of his own party. And they're not going to get those independent people going over because they're going to be highly skeptical. And those people are not going to say, well, hey, I'm just going to go over to Trump with it, because when we saw even at the current level, they're actually independent voters are actually leaning Biden at this point. And that's why when we start to look at them is we saw that the way that they voted with it. I mean, even in the last election, we saw it was not about a point of basically pro-Trump versus pro-Biden. It was actually an anti-Trump versus anti-Biden vote, and that was really what the whole thing was about. So Trump wasn't really on the ballot beyond his policies, and his policies were not positively taken. Even people who voted for Trump were not really voting positively on his policies, because when we start to look at the Pew Research polls, we see that his policies in the whole country, with it regardless of party, were negatively received, because we see the GOP voters do not receive actually across the whole spectrum. It doesn't matter if you're talking Democrats, independents and third parties, or Republicans. We see that going against immigration is not received well. Going against free trade is not received well. And those were his two corner points. That's basically nationalism. And this is why nationalism globally is dying. And when we start to see in the future, we're going to see that future-wise is that it's going to die. And it's not living very well with it. That's why what mostly got him in is a celebrity with it. And when I'm figuring with these average numbers with it, that's just assuming I'm breaking up these groups of his supporters in even amounts. Now, obviously, they're not necessarily going to be even amounts. A lot of his supporters actually happen to come through from these GOP loyalists and through the celebrity. So when you start to view that, you're going to start realizing that if you were to break off into a third party, it would not be successful. This is why he's actually discussed the idea of that he doesn't want to go off into a third party. He knows it would be a complete disaster. It would be a complete and utter money pit. The only reason why he actually, personally with it, of what I think with it, the only reason why he went into politics was basically to get around the middleman. Because if you looked at for so many decades, he was actually paying politicians for a lot of cronyism. This allowed him to basically do it himself and allow his kids to run the thing while he was basically doing all of the cronyism from the top. And that was basically what was actually happening. When you saw the expansion of the DC hotel, and then basically being able to profit off it from getting a lot of diplomats in. And now that he's out with it, you're going to find that it's going to be a lot harder. And that even when we start to look at it politically with it, I mean, for the idea of a split term, I mean, on the idea of a split term, this is going to be another thing that would be impacting it as well, is basically when we start to look at nationalism in the United States, the last real nationalist leader that we've actually had was FDR. We're talking, this is a long time ago. We're talking, this is late 40s. And it doesn't work. You don't actually have leaders like this that actually last. And the last leader we had was that would have been it would have actually been in 2 non-consecutive terms was Grover Cleveland, and that wasn't even in the 20th century. And that's not exactly what we would call feasible for someone to actually have a chance at winning. And if you're trying to go back to using numbers of someone that actually served in the end of the 19th century as something, I mean, if you look at the number of paved roads we had, I mean, that's just insane. I mean, this is basically going back, I mean, not much after when we had in Great Britain when they actually had Jack the Ripper, the Jack the Ripper killings, and that should be a little bit of a clue of the era that we're speaking of there. And this is like an archaic era with it. When, I mean, even when we go back to the era of in the of basically before the 1920s, we did not have that many miles of paved road. So if you're talking, so if he's trying to go back to then for when the last time that we actually had a split one there with it, then we had to go back to the late 1940s, the last time we actually had a nationalist president before. So it's just not popular. Nationalism is just not popular in the country. The country's always been in the idea of global trade. This is kind of how the country is founded. If you look at the idea of Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, he actually had this idea of pretty much supporting the idea of xenophilia, which is basically the love of what is exotic. And if you look at the whole world, the whole world is basically has always been on this idea of established on the idea of spice trades. Essentially, the United States would not have been essentially founded or anything had it not, or even anything, I should say, west of Europe would not have even been most likely discovered in the modern sense with it, had it not been for the idea of trying to discover spices, or I should say a better route for spices. And that was the whole idea. And when we start to do that with it, we need to understand that this is the whole idea of spice routes, and the whole idea because of the idea of trade. And it's always been trade that's always pushed things. And to go against this idea of global trade and global movement of people, that's kind of against the actual national interest. And you're not going to find that be very, very productive, because when we start to view things with it, people don't just want what's landlocked within our country. Because even such a thing as I've discussed this in the past before with such as things like coffee. Coffee is a very simple thing, and if you start to limit that to what is only produced in the United States, coffee's going to go up to be very, very expensive. Everybody likes coffee, and if you're saying we only can get coffee grown in Hawaii, that's going to be very expensive, because everybody's going to fight over it, and we're going to get then market pricing, and it's going to go up. That's why nationalism is not popular. And then we end up getting to the idea of, well, we'll allow this in with it. Well, we'll allow that in. Well, at what point are we basically going to start making exceptions on what we can allow in and what we can't? Well, then nationalism starts breaking apart. That's why nationalism doesn't work, because you can't just all of a sudden break things apart. And once you allow a couple things in, with you have to allow everything in, and you have to allow trade back and forth. And that's how the global economy works, because you can't just all of a sudden let a bunch of goods in, not allow goods out, because your country's going to go bankrupt. And the same thing when it comes down to labor back and forth, tourism back and forth. You can't just basically, if you're going to basically say they're not allowed to come in with it, well, your tourism industry is going to go bankrupt, and our tourism industry is hurting when other countries' tourism industries are starting to recover. Our tourism industry is still hurting, and there's a reason for it, because you're not allowing any other countries in. And this is a problem, because we have all these hoops that people have to jump through. And this is basically a product of nationalism. And it ends up being an economic killer. And if we look at what nationalism did for us back then, nationalism, all it did is it basically took the Great Depression and it extended it out far longer than it ever needed to be. And that was basically what these people that were part of the progressive era did. That's all they did. They basically made things far worse than they ever needed to be. And this is why those leaders were basically some of the worst leaders our country ever had. If you're a nationalist leader, you are one of the nationalist leader or part of the leader, which is basically the same thing as the progressive movement. You are part of the problem. And that's why it doesn't actually work with, because we've actually seen these things before. And it's why things just don't grasp the way they do with it. And the reason why Trump is able to do it was this a mix of celebrity, a mix of kind of dressing it up a little bit different. It's why authoritarians are able to always kind of do these things, because they're able to authoritarians will always exist with it, because they're always able to dress things up a little bit different. And so it's always going to happen. And people just need to be very, very skeptical of things like that, because they're always going to dress things up. Anytime where there's where someone wants to make tribalism, wants to basically make this little us versus them, if they're doing an us versus them, assume they're an authoritarian. Anytime where they're basically saying that they're looking out for your best interest, assume they're not. Assume they're not. Because the fact is, they're they're a scam artist. If they're saying they want to basically allow you to make all your own decisions and do not want to blame anyone else with it, and say you're responsible for your own decisions, and that you should be do not want to blame the media or anything like that with it, they basically say the media should be should be highly skeptical of the government. If they're willing to do that, those are the people you want in office. The people that are basically wanting to blame the media for everything, those are authoritarians. Doesn't matter if they want to blame part of the media, all the media with it, want to blame foreign countries for everything with it. Those are the people that are actually those are the people who are actually problematic. And there have been people that have been doing it for the last 12 years. And frankly, with it, when Biden decided to not push tribalism, that's actually kind of what helped him win. Not saying Biden's anywhere close to perfect. Do not like his platform one bit, but avoiding tribalism is the only thing that I would say is a positive thing, and that's kind of what helped him propel him to win. And when we start to look at it, that's kind of what helped him win and was able to kill Trump. Not necessarily that he was able to offer anything good, but that he was able to actually say, well, fighting between Americans is a bad idea, and it doesn't solve anything. And the fact is, when you start going up with it, you're going to have a high success rate. And that's why when we start to look at with things with it, you're always going to have a low success rate when you start getting infighting. When you start having people fight amongst themselves with it, you're never going to have people on the other side ever like you. You're never going to have a high success rate with people in the middle, unless your ideas are positive. Even and then what ends up happening is you end up having problems. And then the best you can do with tribalism is become issue by issue for basically having the way independent and third party voters feel about you. It's never going to be an actual general feel about how you're doing. It's going to fluctuate week to week, and it can look up and down and up and down and up and down. But if you avoid tribalism, you can actually maintain a much higher percentage. But if you that's why when you start to get to the worship of an actual person, and which is this like cultish behavior, that the tribalism, you're going to find that it gets far worse. And that's basically what this idea of the MAGA has been. MAGA has gone basically to the whole thing of what under Obama was. They just basically accelerated it. And everything that people thought Obama was going to be was basically is what MAGA was. And even at best with it, and as I've stated, even at best, what are called the maximum loyalists are not going to be a high number of people. It's going to be less than 250,000 people per state. It's going to be no more than about 11 million people nationally, or about 12 million people nationally at most. That's not a lot of people. That means that's not enough to win an election. That's not even enough to sway an election. I mean, you're talking, and especially if you start irritating the other people that are actually in the GOP, if the GOP starts losing more people with it, you're not going to basically be able to win. These people are not going to be able to cover. So in a third party with it, they're not going to be able to cover with it. When you start to view these things with it, they're never. It would be actually more positive to let these people go, because at best with it, you're going to get a good portion of the people that are saying, well, I'm just going to vote GOP anyway. The celebrity people are basically, the most that they're going to do is they're going to basically become non-voters. So they're not going to vote for the other side. The conspiracy people are just going to split up anyway. The racist people basically are most likely going to become non-voters. Your nationalists are naturally going to go to are only going to vote if they find a one of these democratic socialists, and the celebrity ones are just going to go. Celebrity ones are going to go away with it. You have, and that's what you're left with in the end, with and you'll end up finding out that you're not going to lose as much as you think. And in the actual of the other 2/3, you're not going to have as much of a drought. See, the thing you need to do with it is, if you have troublesome voters with it that are actually, you don't want them to actually steer the actual party. If they're actually causing it to where the party is actually losing its actual identity, then let them go. Because essentially with it, the GOP has never been about nationalism, except during the progressive era, and that was basically during a short period, and that was never really about its identity. The GOP has never been about celebrity. Historically, the GOP has never been about conspiracy theorists, and the GOP has never, beyond a couple of small members they wanted to kick out real quick about racism. You think that the GOP has actually been the party that actually pushed for all of the voting rights acts. It's only been right now in which they've actually tried to block them and actually try to put ones to actually make it harder to vote. And that's been the thing with it. And seeing that they're actually doing the exact opposite is actually appalling. I mean, the closest they've done against voting rights is basically just want voter ID. That's it. The closest they wanted with it is just a basic voter ID. But in those states, they basically, what they said is, we'll give you a free ID. Just bring the ID to vote. That's been the closest they've done before. Regardless of where you vote with it, just bring the ID and bring it to vote. But we'll give you a free ID. That's been the closest thing that they've ever done. But when we start to look at it with it historically, is that they've never had these things. Obviously, nationalism has been in both parties before with it, but it was actually rooted out by 1950. Now that they bring it back, and it's been troublesome. And they're going to realize that basically, if they go down this with it, they're going to be the Know Nothing part, equal to the Know Nothing Party, which essentially became defunct. And if they want to go basically down the idea of being a nationalist conspiracy party, a nationalist racist conspiracy party with it, I mean, they can actually do that, which would be going the idea of like these of what the potential loyalists would be. I mean, they can do that, but the fact is it would be technically going defunct very, very quickly. And that's basically what MAGA is about. Because the celebrity is going to go away. And that's not going to last. And that's why when you start to look at these things, it's not a sustainable thing with, because obviously we're seeing globally, when you start taking away the celebrity with it, it just doesn't last. We've seen people trying to get definite change in Turkey. We've seen the United Kingdom take a definite change in their situation with Boris Johnson no longer backing nationalism. He basically, once he got in, he pretty much took a 180. You see countries that still have with it, such as the Philippines, and they're getting protests. You see down in Brazil, where Bolsonaro is basically, once Trump lost the election, he started to worry with it and started to complain about fake news and all these other things about him, because he realized he's the next on the chopping block. And then we know that Duterte is going to be next on the chopping block as well for his sexist comments post the typhoon that they had out there. And for the authoritarian actions with it, in which he tried to wanted to try to overrule their Supreme Court, and even try to overrule the legislative branch. And they're going to find out that he's not going to win a new election, because they're not exactly keen on him, because he did the same thing Trump did and ran on something completely different than what he actually did. And this means that nationalism is not winning globally. And we saw the same thing in France. France that didn't even take hold. And especially with everything that's going on with it, I mean, you're not seeing any favorability in nationalism. Nationalism is going down. Trump's favorability on his favorability rankings have only gone down worse. And traditionally with it, a favorability ranking for a president goes up after they leave office, but that's usually when they keep their mouths shut. And frankly, we've seen this where he doesn't want to do that. And it's usually when you basically kind of step away from politics and you kind of go off and do something else. And that's usually what raises your favorability post-presidency. Well, he doesn't want to do that, and he's still repeating the election lie, and that's not exactly going to be doing anything for this whole MAGA movement. That's going to kill it, and it's going to kill it a lot faster. We're going to see by basically 2022 that this thing's going to die a very nasty death, because we see that people like John Barrasso are actually backing people like Murkowski and Cheney in their for their nominations with it when Trump wants to oppose them. We're seeing an actual split now, and we're seeing serious big name people that are actually starting to contest Trump. And I think it's going to start adding up now. These are people who essentially voted against impeachment, but are actually backing people with it and saying it's going to do damage to our party, and say, "You idiot, with it, we're not doing this." And I think what's going to happen with it is people are going to be going against what they did at CPAC. And I think the CPAC crowd is going to be shut down, because CPAC has been nothing but basically nothing but a nationalist group with it, because they've essentially been nothing but pander to Trump. And it's not, it used to be open to a lot of other things, but now it's basically this nationalism and nativism. And that's what it's all about now. It's not about actually conservatism anymore. And I'm speaking from an actual third party with it, because I'm a libertarian anyway. So, and I'm not exactly speaking from a person that's going to be loyal to any type of faction in the GOP, or speaking as like a Democrat or anything like that. No, I'm basically speaking as a libertarian, saying what's actually happening. And it's basically what's happening to the party is it's collapsing on its own with it. And what you're going to find with it, eventually they're going to realize that we have to do something. That's what's going to happen. That's what they're going to be eventually doing. They're going to realize with it, if they don't want to basically be destroyed, they're going to have to do something about Trump and basically pretty much censure him. Minimum censure him. Censure him and censure his movement and end it. Because the fact is if they might not be able to wait for the court system to do something. Now, they had an option to do something in the impeachment, but they end up growing weak-kneed. What it seems like they're hoping is that basically as he gets is that his movement gets eviscerated in the midterms. I think that's what they're hoping for. But that's not exactly good with it, because then they're basically kind of like playing in the middle with it, and it basically allows him to tend to basically try to damage the rest of the party. And the fact is I don't think they're realizing that. I think some of them are now realizing that he's trying to damage the rest of the party. And I think they're starting to realize that now, and realize that basically is that you're almost immediately into re-election season. They need to realize that we need to get rid of these troublesome people, number one. Number two is you need to basically realize that this is not going to do any positive for the party in the long run. In the long run, this thing's going to be basically nothing but a footnote. And number two is that even with it being a footnote, is that it could also do categorically massive damage to the party. Even people that are conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones have even come out and saying that he never wished he met he wished he never met Donald Trump and Roger Stone, calling them basically both scam artists. And because when we start to look at it with it, because he feels it was bad for his brand. And basically that's what's going on within both of those two are like that. And pretty much without people like Alex Jones, Trump probably would not have made this, because a lot of it was based on the conspiracy theory stuff with it. And once they could, and a mix of that and a mix of the celebrity that kind of got him over the hump in 2016. There were some people on the single issue people about it that got him elected on stuff that he said he was going to do, but he never did. Lower the debt, go to audit the Federal Reserve, go to a gold standard, bring people home from the wars. He said he was going to do that immediately. Yeah, look what happened with that. That was basically lowering the libertarian vote with it, but he never did a thing with it. I mean, he could have ordered that via executive order immediately. I mean, because that is actually over his power. But he never did that at all. He could have actually ordered it immediately. He could have put executive order saying, "Oh, I'm ordering it immediately," and actually pull in an actual final removal date and put that on an actual executive order. But he let in all these other groups with it that didn't matter at all with it, and it shows that he never had a point with that. And it shows basically that he really never he really had ulterior motives with it. This is why the MAGA stuff really is. He has his own motives with it, plus there's other people in there that have their own motives as well. When you start to get people like Stephen Miller and Peter Navarro, their motive is nativism. And when you look at them, their record is basically being complete and utter losers. And I don't mean just calling them names. I mean their actual record for being positive impact is very, very negative. And even when it comes to politics for actual successes, they don't have any. When you look at Stephen Miller, I mean, he was actually, before Trump, he had actually ended 8 political careers. When you look at Peter Navarro, he had basically tried to run before in politics and had never won. He had even made a documentary basically blaming China and Germany for the faults of for the currency faults of the United States, which is completely erroneous. And the documentary was a complete and utter failure financially. And it shows that basically, usually when you make a documentary, you can basically make a good amount of money as long as you're not like a no name, as long as you have names attached to it that are actually somewhat at least like a mid-level person with it. You can actually get some people you can actually make some good money from it. Now he actually did that, and he turned basically the Ishtar version of a documentary out of it by basically losing money out of it. And I don't know how you actually managed to do that one. You'd have to be really freaking stupid for that one. And that's who he brought in for basically dealing with his administration, beyond a bunch of neocons. The rest were basically a bunch of neocons for his administration. And lo and behold, with it, what you end up getting was a bunch of garbage. And then he brought people that were basically authoritarians. Beyond that, I mean, ahead of neocons with it, these are people that actually believed in actual martial law. Specifically at the end with it, these were people who believed in martial law. And it's like, these aren't people who believe in the actual country. These are people who believe in actual martial law. And these are people on the level of like Ferdinand Marcos. That, I mean, you're talking that this is what it boils down to, and it wasn't exactly like someone who would actually be legitimate. And that's why when we start to look at what his movement is, it's not going to be legitimate. And especially in the future, there is no actual legitimate place for his movement anymore. And it's only going to dwindle from here on forward with it, because obviously racism is going to die out. Racism is, I mean, if you look at the age of the people, these people aren't young. They're basically, most of them are age 50 and older, and they're just going to die off. The conspiracy people with it, they're basically, eventually, a lot of them, they just give up with it, and they just kind of get out of the mix with it. You're going to get more people that are going to come on to the next conspiracy with it, but there's no real political agenda to it. His celebrity eventually is going to die off, and he's just going to become essentially a nobody. On nationalism, once nationalism dies off this time with it, is probably not going to become popular, probably for, I'd say, it's at least another 80 years. Those people that are that are his supporters, the GOP, then they're going to be gone. They're only there with it to support the GOP nominee. That's it. Then he's left with nothing. So when it comes down to the future with it, it actually shows there is no future for this. It is not sustainable. His celebrity is not going to last with it, because even on this with it is, without him and his family, and even with his family with it is not really as anywhere near as popular as he is. So basically, what are we talking? A few years from now with it, the actual celebrity level is going to crash out, because he's only popular with it because of the reality shows and the other stuff like that with it. His family, they're kind of like no names when it comes down to it. They might have some bit of celebrity via him, but nowhere near. Once he's gone with it, they're not going to have the celebrity factor like him. So it's going to be completely dwindled. It's not like where the actual full effect is going to transfer. When it comes down to nationalism is dying and dying hard with it. And it basically, once it fully dies out with it, you're probably not going to find it again for another 80 years. And this is just what ends up happening. And this time it's because of the way these political cycles go. You're probably not going to the governmental cycles go. You're probably not going to find it for a long. You're probably going to find each cycle tend to be a lot shorter and shorter and shorter. With it, how the last one was a lot longer, that's because the way information moves. Well, information moves a lot faster now, and the next time it's probably going to move even faster with it, where it might not even hit the United States. Conspiracy theories with it, who knows with it if the next one, if it's even going to hit where conspiracy theories are even picked up by the government, and if it's even going to be able to be worked positively. He was able to work it positively with it, but if things change with it, they might not even be able to work it positively. Or if people are even going to if it's even going to be worked in such a way that it could be politically advantageous. And then basically, racism is dying. It has been for a long time. It's not the effective tool that it once was during the last nationalist movement, which was the progressive movement. It's not an effective tool anymore. And it's not going to be an effective tool. And that's one thing people need to realize. It's not an effective tool. Most of the people that were actually out there with it, it's not that they were racist, it's that the fact is that they were actually believing conspiracy theories. It's not racism that's actually the cause. It's these conspiracy theories and these wild accusations of these things that they're believing. That's where it's all coming from. And that's the actual issue that's actually had caused all of his rise for anything. Other than that, I guarantee you with it is that nationalism doesn't survive. I mean, this is why it only survived for about, in my opinion, 12 years. Because we need to understand that Obama was just as much of a nationalist. Even with his apology tour around the globe with it and all that other stuff with it, he still focused on a basic nationalist agenda. Because the fact is with it is he was still very, very nativist when it came down to a lot of policies. he still what it called. He just ended up focusing on a more urban-based nativist policy than a what it called than a rural and suburban focus one with it. But it's the same idea. Just because you have a guy focusing on a rural-based nativist policy, it doesn't make it any different. And that's the whole idea with it, is that it was the same idea, because you got to think that Obama was throwing a bunch of Mexicans out of the country with it. He was this idea of trying to push unions. He did not want other people. He was just as much against other people in the country. He did heavy limits of people coming in, because I mean, if you look at the amount of people coming out with it, and when we start to, and you'll find out, is actually because of his raise in funding on people on the for border patrol with it. You're going to find out that in fact during his amount per year is that he would have actually had a higher rate of people thrown out than Trump. Because when we start to get 2020, the reason why I say that is when we start to get 2020 back, you're going to actually find out that it was actually that 2020 was actually and actually when we start to look at it, is also he was one that implemented stricter things on the TSA. There was actually for all these things of even like people coming in. So it was him who was actually doing all these things. And he was the one that was actually doing a lot of these things, that was actually doing all these types of policies. Trump, all Trump did was just really kind of continue it through. I mean, he was the one kind of continuing a lot of these policies that were against the stuff and trying to do these things that were basically done to protect American jobs and all these other things like that. So he was doing the same thing, same types of policies with it. Yes, he was pumping money into green energy with it, but basically it's the same ideas. But he was still doing subsidies to oil companies. He was also doing subsidies to green energy companies. He was still doing the same things that Trump was doing. It's just a matter of Trump was doing a little bit more in certain areas and a little bit less in other areas with it. And basically, and what happens with it, we're going to see that how when Trump was not allowing legal immigration in, we're going to find out with it, because that's the way Border Patrol's funded. We're going to find out that basically the number of immigrants that actually came through is actually going to be a higher amount. Because the fact is with it is that when you don't have the money to pay those people, and you're going through debt and these other problems like that, it causes a lot of problems for the actual Border Patrol. And that's going to cause a lot of issues. And we obviously know that Arizona's law for a lot of getting rid of illegal immigrants did not change anything with pay. They had actually experienced lower pay from that. So that's even an issue with that. But when we start to view at the whole thing with the idea of all what he didn't actually do anything with it with the border wall. All he did was actually go and replace it. So it wasn't actually anything that he was actually doing, adding wall. So what Trump actually did is he actually raised the debt to actually just replace pieces of border wall. Didn't he replace that many of them? And we found that he basically all he did was basically use money, and he shut down a lot of funding for USCIS, which is what basically funds the Border Patrol, by shutting off immigration, which is he by shutting off legal immigration, that was the way they can get their offsets, and also how the State Department gets their offsets, and it can cause a lot of problems. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to create a lot more illegal immigration. for those of people that believe in the separation between legal and illegal. To me, immigration is immigration, but that's a totally different story. Now, when we start to view this is why when we start to view the whole thing on Trump, we're going to find out once the 2020 records come in, it probably won't be till later this year. You're going to find out that his averages are probably going to be far higher than Obama for the percentages for people let in. That means his whole nativist policy that he wanted to go in for shutting down in 2020 was actually a complete disaster. And you're going to find out that, and he's going to try to basically pin it off and blaming Biden, but it's not going to work. And it's going to show that the policy is going to be a disaster. And what that's going to cause is a lot of these nationalists are going to be like, why are we even backing you? A lot of the celebrity people, by then, with him being kind of off Twitter and off the main stuff with it, they're going to be lost. A lot of the conspiracy people, once all these things are just not coming true, a lot of those are dying out for people on his side. A lot of the racists with it are probably going to go to non-voters, and he's going to be left with nothing. He's going to, and what's going to happen with it is any people that are trying to run on this nationalist agenda are probably not going to win. It's probably going to have to be someone going against the grain. And they're probably going to have to do that going against the grain because that's the only way to do it. Because as we've seen with these GOP voters, a lot of them are mixed. A lot of them are mixed ticket people now. And even with the DNC voters. So you need to get to these voters here. And even when when you see these voters out of the total voters, out of the independents are the ones that strike. So basically, theoretically, is as long as you can get the nomination out of your side, either the GOP or the DNC or the Democrats or Republicans, is basically all you need. Theoretically, is about 34% of the total population. And that means you could theoretically just get it out of the independents. Or basically, if you wanted to get it with it, you can roughly get it from your side and basically, and just basically getting half of the independent vote. That's all you have to do with it. So, and most of your stuff with it, and even if you don't get it much of your side with it, even if your side decides, yeah, I don't like you with it, I mean, you could basically get most of it from those independent voters anyway. And so that's why it doesn't even matter when it comes down to your base. That's why when some of these candidates say, I'm just going to focus on my base, your base doesn't matter. Originally with it before, I would say before Barack Obama with it, when we were going like the period of George W. Bush and before, yes, it mattered. But once we started to get people that end up going further and further toward their base, it ended up pushing a lot of people out. And by about 2010, you end up finding that basically that the base didn't matter anymore. And people just end up leaving in droves, and people just did not like the parties anymore because the parties did not have neither party had a clear, concise message. And because they all had these factions, and since there was no clear, concise message, no one actually wanted to be a member. There wasn't like one message. I mean, when you join with the Libertarian Party with it, basically the only disagreement is basically, are you pro-life or pro-choice? That's like the only disagreement that you'll find. When you start going with with these things with it, there's massive disagreements on foreign policy. There's massive disagreements on even in like the GOP. I mean, you could be anywhere between dovish to hawkish. You could be what it called from basically on spending with it. You can be from dovish to hawkish on the budget. You could be you could be anywhere from like a like a Keynesian or neo-Keynesian all the way out. This is like even on the GOP, all the way out to like an Austrian type of person with it on the way to view the monetary policy. I mean, you could be all over the board. You could be more of a nativist to more what it called to closer to open borders when the border policy. I mean, on immigration policy. I mean, you could be all over the board, and there's no clear, concise thing with it. There is no message. I mean, basically, is they just want to be this like this little thing of like basically God and basically God and God, guns, and the First Amendment. They just wanted to be that with it. Now it's not even fully that with Trump, but because he doesn't even back that. But for the rest of them with it, they just basically embrace that. So when you start, even when you start minusing the MAGA stuff with it, it's still God, guns, and the First Amendment with it. Beyond what it called, beyond that, that allows you like too much wiggle room. Democrats, you can get anywhere from like socialists to more of like your blue dogs with it. So that's a lot of wiggle room. You have people who believe in basically post-birth abortion all the way out to pro-life. I mean, that's even on the abortion thing with it. You have some people who are a little bit tighter on the budget, not necessarily a true balanced budget, but a little tighter on the budget, to people who don't believe in believe in modern monetary theory. I mean, on that. So on the DNC side, and some people that are hawkish on foreign policy to some people that are dovish, and they're even the same way with it. So when it comes down to the things, and that's why when you start to see the thing, that's why nobody really belongs to the party anymore. And that's why when you start to view it with it, if you lose a third, that's why the GOP being worried about losing a third of the party, that's nothing. A third of the 20% of the real overall voters with it is nothing. That's like roughly 7%. Or of the total people in the country with it, which is like about 4.5%. That's why we don't actually focus on these actual voters. And that's why we say on these MAGA loyalists with it, they're not expected to get on for total with it any more than about 12 million. And that's not much. That's a very, very small amount. I mean, the average one for independents with it, I mean, that's roughly about like 4 states for for your independent voters, independent third party voters. That's like 4 states worth. And we know that basically that's basically could kill them with 4 to 5 states with it. Basically 5 states would automatically beat them, and would automatically beat the total amount of MAGA voters. 5 average states. So when you start viewing that is that's about the average of about like a 10 to 11 point state. So 5 states between around 10 to 11 points. Would actually be larger than the whole MAGA force in the country. Which would be approximately about equal to whatever equals basically to like in the electoral college with it would be roughly about like 54 points on individual 54 points from individual states. Or from individual areas with it. So when we start to view that. Or from 54 points of states worth. So you could theoretically just get it from California alone. And that's where we sit it with it, and that's why they're not a very effective movement. Because I mean, theoretically, if you could just get it from one state, could such do it. And since we know this is split up, and that's when we talk about some of these massive amounts with it. Because we know we cannot count. We know that we cannot count on any of these people who are basically just the people in the GOP, people of the MAGA that just support the GOP, because they're just anti-DNC voters. There's anti-Democrat voters. But for everyone else with it, basically you're left with a certain amount with it that's setting around there. And even at max with it, they're basically sitting at about 300,000 per state. That's nothing. Next to like the 2.8 million per state with it, I mean, of independents with it, it shows that they're nobodies. And any movement like that with it, it shows basically with the potential of what they have to rely upon. And you really shouldn't buy into this idea that there are like 11 type of Trump voters with it. Basically, there aren't. It basically falls into 5 groups. And with it, and if we start to view them as all is even with it, now obviously they're not going to be even. The racist ones are far smaller with it. I'm giving them more credit than they are. Basically, the largest groups are going to be for those GOP ones with it. And next largest group is going to be for the celebrity, then your nationalist, then conspiracy, and then racist. Race is going to be first, smallest with it, then conspiracy, then your nationalists are next with it. They're kind of about the same size. Conspiracy and nationalists are about the same size. Then celebrity and GOP. Basically, with celebrities falling, obviously, GOP are basically going to leave. That means when you start to view the thing with it, you're going to view that he's not going to have anything left is in the end, because the celebrity and the GOP are GOP is not going to leave. The celebrity is not going to go along with him, as I've stated, or is going to go along with him until he loses his kind of star power. Which is, and especially with his health wise, once he kicks off, it's not going to transfer well to the kids. The conspiracy, once the QAnon stuff goes away with it, which is not going to be much longer. By the end of the year, it's probably going to die off, because they're only going to be able to kick the can down the road so long. And if with the idea of was it was like 4chan, now it's like 8chan or something, now they call it, with that basically spreading the QAnon stuff, with that basically saying that basically that they kind of right around the time of the election that they kind of stopped with it. So now it's this random people kind of spreading these rumors, and there's no actual ones that have actually since the election have come out with any of these QAnon stuff. So really, it's not gonna last. We're talking months away from this stuff. It's dying and dying fast, and a lot of people are leaving and leaving fast. The same thing with the celebrities. Celebrities not going to last long. Now, nationalists has always been split between Trumpers and Bernie Bros. Now, Bernie Bros jumped on Trump's thing with it, obviously because he was president. What's going to happen with that is they're going to go right back to being Bernie Bros. And that's just the whole thing with it. The people that claim that they're nationalists, that are what I call they're with the GOP with it. Once the GOP kind of like dumps Trump with it, they're not going to be nationalists anymore. They're going to say, "Oh no, I'm not a nationalist anymore." With it, that's what's going to happen. And you're going to have now you're basically left with like those racists at the end with it. Now, as I said, there's not many of those nationally with it. Most of those people that a lot of the media thinks are racist are not really. What they end up are is nationalists that are jumping on the nationalist nativist thing with it. It's not necessarily that they're racist per se. Is basically they're saying, "Oh, but I don't want to lose my job to a immigrant." No, it's not that they're. So what they're doing is they're basically saying is they want protectionism. They're not necessarily racist per se. It's just their actual what it calls. They want the government to actually implement policies that are protectionist, just the same way that we have affirmative action and things like this. They just want affirmative action basically to benefit them and basically say, I want you to benefit me and basically block everyone around me. They don't want an actual free market system for labor, for goods, for all these other things with it. They want to basically be the recipient of special treatment. And that's basically what it is. It's not necessarily that they're racist per se with it. It's just basically they want policies that have a racist outcome. The actual number of races with it has actually steadily gone down. Now, obviously, we've seen policies that are actually definitely racist under tribalism over the last 12 years, but that have actually kind of slightly increased the number with it. But I think it's more under. I don't think it's more necessarily really increasing the numbers highly. It's more basically the idea of it's been as a defense mechanism. More as racism as a defense mechanism than anything else on a lot of different sides with it. So that's basically what's happened there. But what we're finding with it is that you're not going to find much once you start to actually get rid of the tribalism. You're not going to find it. It's just going to continue to drive it out because we don't necessarily have the idea of a huge number of people that I find out there that actually have this idea that I don't want people that don't look like me. There's not a huge number of people like that anymore. It exists out there. Don't kid yourself. That does exist. But that's especially with an older generation of like 50 and older. And that's just what ends up existing out there. And it's not going to go away until these people die off. You're not going to convince these people with it. And it's just what ends up happening. You can't convince people of it. They essentially basically believe this with it, and they believe them as an actual threat to their lifestyle of they want their little white bread, uncultured lifestyle, and they don't want anything to intrude on that. And that's not going to change. And until these people die off, you're not going to have anything change with that. And that's been the whole thing with it, with how culture kind of changes. Sometimes you just need people to die off. And sometimes this is just the thing with it, where you just need just the next generation. This is kind of like be the leaders of the thing, and carriers of the torch. Because the fact is that you end up finding that now it's not all people 50 and older with it. There's a lot of people are 50 and older who just do not believe in this garbage. There's plenty of them with it who are 50 and older that are basically do not believe in this crap, and who believe what it calls who believe in judging people by the content of their character, and don't believe in this idea of this white identity and white culture and all this other garbage. And just the thing with it, I'm not 100% white. I have a portion of me is Native American with it, so I'm not 100% white. My fiance is a Filipina. My brother married a black girl. My niece is half black. So we're talking that we just come from a natural mixed background. My whole family does. So it's just a matter of what ends up going in, and I'm one who believes what it called being that it's genetically positive, that this is for the best for the future. You don't get you don't help out your bloodline by actually marrying in with the same thing with it. That's eventually, if you only marry the people basically who agree with keeping a white bloodline, what's going to end up happening is you're going to get inbreeding eventually, because there's a lot of white people who just do not believe in not breeding in with other races. So you're eliminating those people, and then when you start eventually getting down to it, you're going to eventually have to marry into your own family, like cousins and such, and you're going to interbreed. And that's the whole thing with this whole nativist idea. If you want to keep it going with it, at least in through your bloodline, you're going to have to interbreed. And that's another point that I've actually discussed as well on some of these boards and what it calls, and I haven't gotten any comment back with it. It's probably for a reason, because the fact is that it's the truth. Because it's not in the future for this stuff to exist anymore. And even when we go to our founders with it, I mean, they would have called our country was not founded by a monolithic culture. We had multiple races coming over with it. Some of our early slave owners were black. So we know that when we look at our actual thing in the United States, that the United States was not meant for this little white culture stuff. White culture was actually something that came out of the Progressive era as a preservation for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant movement. And that's basically it. And people don't understand that. And that's basically what it was for. People did not want the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to dissipate. And when we start to view that, is that that's basically what was occurring. And that when we start to see the idea of eugenics and things like that, that was basically what it was for. It was not for this idea of it having any legitimacy to it. That was the whole idea of this idea of eugenics. And them trying to create this idea of saying that other races that had a higher melanin content, or other groups of people that higher melanin content, were actually lower levels of people. That was the whole idea behind it. And that's what this whole thing comes from. That's why when people heard the idea of where Trump was speaking to a group of like white people from Minnesota, knowing that they were from knowing their genealogy was basically mostly from Northern Europe with it, when he said they come from good genes with it, that was basically he was speaking about eugenics. And that was something in which he's speaking, that's the whole idea of this idea of the progressive movement, was about eugenics. And that goes along with the idea of this nationalism, is that we don't want people who have dark melanin contents in our country. And because they are actually, they're not like us, and they're, this is the idea of calling people like, from the idea of like SL countries, and from, saying that what do you call people from live in huts, or what do you call all of AIDS, or basis, what do you call it? He just wants to demean people that have darker melanin contents. Doesn't matter if you come from the Mediterranean area of Europe, come from Africa, the Middle East, if you come from certain areas in Asia, if you come from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, it doesn't matter. He just does not want people there. As I said, he wants people from like the he wants people from like the Northern Europe area. Northern Europe, and what do you call it, some area, only certain areas of Central Europe. And that's basically it. He wants people that are of fair skin. And that was the whole point. And these are things that are actually come about from FAIR, which is a anti-immigration group that actually comes off of from all their people are actually come from both the Sierra Club and Planned Parenthood, which are pro-eugenics groups. And that's where it is when people think, oh no, Trump doesn't come from the left wing. Yes, he does. He is far left wing. He's left wing authoritarian. And that's the whole idea of what we find in nationalism. That's why when you start to see with it why nationalism why this MAGA movement can't survive, that's why is because it doesn't even fit to where he's trying to run from. That's one of the core ideas. It doesn't fit to where he's trying to run from, and it's why it died so quickly with the with both parties. It's why it lasts longer with the Democrats in the, what I call it, in the progressive era with it, but when they tried to switch over to the GOP, it died real quickly in the GOP when we started looking back then. But nowadays, when we got the media cycle going so fast, it doesn't last long, and we're going to see very, very quickly with it that it doesn't really grab a hold of it. Now, back then, with you can grab a hold of your party and get a lot of members in with it. Nowadays, you can't. And that was back then when you can actually deal with like the Democrats had all the a lot of these Dixiecrats with it, and you can get Republicans that were actually part of the progressive movement in different areas of the country, and you can actually rely upon them, even in local offices. Nowadays, you can't rely upon them with it because there's the different factions, and you can't really get them on board, and they can flip at any moment, and there's a lot of elections that can actually remove people with it. A lot of times there was not as much turnover. Nowadays there's a lot of turnover, and that's why when it comes down to things with it, movements can die pretty fast with it. And this is almost going to be to the level of what a third party would do, where a third party would end up getting killed. And that's why when Trump says he doesn't want to run a third party, the reason why is because he knows that a third party is going to get killed. Because his maximum loyalists that he would ever have, he knows, would be no more than 12 million people nationally. And there's no guarantee that all those are going to vote in the elections, and that all of those are going to continue through. And that the maximum he probably could count on is like, we're talking no more than like 6 million in an election. And those could actually drop down with it. He could end up expecting basically no more than we're talking then potentially, then he could end up getting no more than like 3 million in an election. And that could be embarrassing with it, and that's at most. And that could be very, very damaging to a third party with it. And that's max with it. And he could end up getting a point where he doesn't even get 1 million votes. And that depends on how these things all work out. And he could end up getting to the point where he's just not even getting that many. And where he would have no impact at all. That's why he doesn't want to run as a third party. He wants to run, and he thinks he can bully into the GOP. That's his theory behind things. Maybe I can bully into the GOP. But the problem being is, if he thinks he could run like he did in 2016 in a primary, that's going to be very hard. And that's where the whole thing goes with it is what I call in 2024, if they actually want to go anywhere, are they really going to actually still have this whole MAGA movement going? And that's the whole point. Right now with it, they think that they could run on the thing with it, but if they get killed in 2022, they're probably going to be dumping it. They're probably going to be going in a different direction. That's the whole thing with it, and he's going to be nothing but a pariah. And I'm basically going to leave it right here with it because we're over 90 minutes, and it's kind of a long stream, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.